Welcome everyone. Tonight we're going to go over portrait retouching in Photoshop. And very specifically, we're going to be talking a lot about skin because with portraits, there's a lot of skin. There's a lot of tools in Photoshop that allow you to make skin look flawless. And there is that avenue that you can take where you're going to make someone look like a supermodel and really take care of their skin to the point where they have no pores. And that's a style choice. And, that we see that on magazine covers, we see that in video, we see that all over the place. We're going to go for something a little bit in between. When it comes to the portrait side and the artistic side of it, it's really your choice how far to go with things. So I want to start by taking a look a little bit at Photoshop. Right now I have one headshot open that I took last year here at the library. And I want to touch base on some of the things that we're going to be taking a look at. So number one is that we tend to want to work when it comes to portraits and doing some major retouching. We really want to work with raw files. So if you are a photographer or if you're taking pictures and you're working with a DSLR, the best thing is to put it in raw. And first, before we really get started, sorry, I should have mentioned this before. Patrick and Jeff are going to be looking at the chat, and occasionally you can add questions in there, but we do prefer you to go to Q&A, and you can put your questions in there, and sometime during the class, they'll hit me with any questions that are pertinent to what I'm doing, or if I need to backtrack a little bit, so you guys can go ahead and put your questions in there. So, okay, let's move on. So we're talking RAW versus JPEG. So this is mainly for DSLR cameras. There are some other cameras that do allow you to shoot in RAW versus JPEG. And basically what it's gonna do is it's gonna give you a very large file. And so I have two files here. It's the same exact picture that I took on a DSLR. And this DSLR allows me to take a JPEG and a RAW file at the same time. And as you can see, there's a big difference in detail. In this JPEG file, if you look, I kind of zoomed in close to the eye, and you can see the eyelashes are very soft. Whereas if we go to the RAW file, we have a little more data to work with. The colors look deeper as well. As you can see, this blue on her shoulders, almost like navy on this side. There is more detail. We can see the little fuzzies at the edge. There's going to be a lot more detail in a RAW file, and it's very evident when you see them side by side like this. So that's why you want to work with RAW files, because they're large files that contain a ton of data. And that way you can kind of really push and pull the pixels to what you want to do. Okay, so we're gonna get back to Photoshop. I just kind of really wanted to illustrate this because most people don't understand the difference between RAW and JPEG, and I get asked that question quite a bit. So that's really an illustration of what RAW and JPEG is. JPEG is going to be a compressed file that your camera processes and gives you an image file. A RAW file is basically just data that can be interpreted by a software like Photoshop. So I opened a RAW file in Photoshop, and usually it'll open into Camera Raw, and we'll take a look at Camera Raw in a little bit. But I opened it because I wanted to talk about the Photoshop environment. So we're going to spend a lot of time in our layers panel, and we're going to make a lot of copies of this image, and we're going to add a lot of effects and filters and things like that. So to make a copy, you can do a couple of things. You can go to right click and you can go duplicate layer, which will allow you to create a background copy, or you can rename it to something that you want to rename it to. And it does give you some options here as to the destination. Whether you want it to start again, you want this copy to be within this document, you want it to be in a new document, or if I had a separate document open, I can make a copy of this in that document as well. Okay, so that's one method. The number 2 method is going to be your keyboard shortcut, which is Command and J. So when I do Command and J, I get an automatic copy of my layer and it renames it to layer 1. So I can't name it. It's just going to automatically name it to a layer plus whatever number it's on. And it's going to put it on top of whatever layer you're copying. So what I had selected, it's going to make that copy and put it on top. So now I have 2 copies of that, and we're going to take a look at the difference. So I'm just going to grab a brush. I'm going to make that brush a little bigger, and I'm just going to squiggle on here. So now, as you can see on my top layer, I have that squiggly line from the brush, but if I turn off this layer with the eyeball here, I see my layer underneath. So you will be able to see what layers, how layers have their own hierarchy. So whatever is on top is going to be visible. And if I had some transparency on this layer, like if I decide to go in here and make a selection, and delete that selection, now you can see I kind of made a punch through into this next layer. So you can see it right here in this little section that I made a hole in that top layer so I can see beneath. So you can do things like that, or you can have layers that only have minimal content or a shape or something like that. But whatever is on top is what's going to be visible. Number 2 is, of course, you want to name your layers, especially when you're getting into projects like what we're going to be doing tonight, and you're going to be adding a ton of layers and you're going to be adding masks and effects and things like that. It can get a little much. So sometimes I have 15 layers going, sometimes I've got 30 layers going. It depends on the project and how far I'm going with it. So, you know, sometimes I will rename the layer something specific, like if I'm working on color correction, I may just name it CC. If I'm working on, say, just the eyes, I'm going to color correct the eyes or add something to the eyes, I'll name it something. So you can come up with your own naming conventions. So I'm going to name this squiggle because that's what I said. And this is my word, I guess, for tonight. So that's where I put my squiggle. But you know, I want to do some other stuff, so I would make maybe a couple more copies of this. And I added maybe a filter to this. So if I go to adjustments and I just add some random filter on top of that one, as you can see, it's giving me this really white gradient, but I can go here and now we see what we cut into to the bottom. And now we see all these effects added on top. So you have all these layers going on. I'm going to turn this one off a little bit, but you can group things as well. So right here, I can leave it named gradient map, or I can call it like sunset colors or whatever I want. But sometimes you do need to kind of group things, and you want to group them because it makes it easier to see. Once you get into like 30, 40 layers, there's not enough room. On this computer, I have a lot of real estate, but if you were working on a, you know, laptop, sometimes the real estate starts to really go away. So you might want to make groups of layers to clean things up. So say I want to make a group of these 2 layers because this layer's got the filter and this is just another layer. So I would select that first filter, and as you can see, it's highlighted in the lighter gray. And I'm going to hold down the shift key on the keyboard, or if I was going to this layer and skipping this layer, I would hold down Command or Control on a PC. So I'm going to hit shift and hold that one. So now I've got 2 separate layers that are, you know, selected, and I can group them in 2 different ways. I can right click, and then I'm going to go to group from layers, and you would be able to name it. So it would say, hey, what do you want to name this group? Or I can just simply do my keyboard shortcut of Command and G or Control and G on a keyboard on a PC. And then it's going to call it group and the number it's on. And then you can just double click inside the name, and you would be able to rename this to sunset filter. Okay. So now we have a group, we have some layers, and we have our image with the little cutout on top and our squiggle. So that's how you would really kind of work with your layers. And then there's a couple little options that you have as well, like you can color code things. So for example, this group, I can assign a color to it. And those color choices are down here. So I would give it like a green color, and it's just gonna color code the little eyeball next to it. And that can work to your benefit if you're working with multiple filters, or if you're working with multiple types of layers. So that way you know, oh, these groups of layers are all for color correction. These groups of layers are all for, you know, effect work. And these groups of layers are all my selections and things like that. So color coding can be beneficial in Photoshop. You also have the ability to change the display size of your thumbnails. So in the layers panel, which is right here, you have these three little lines for your options, and you do have the ability to uh, create new layers and group layers and do things like that. Or sorry, I think you can do that if you right click the empty space in the layers panel. You can select the type of thumbnails that you want to see. For example, right now I have it to small. I can set it to medium, which will give me a bigger preview of my layer, or I can set it to large, which will give me the largest preview of my layers. That all depends on your preference, and it all depends on the real estate that you have. If you have a huge screen, that works to your advantage because you get a large preview. But if you're working with a smaller screen, then you're obviously going to choose a smaller thumbnail. So I'm going to probably go with the medium for now. That seems about right. And then again, we have our little eyeballs. So our little eyeballs are set to kind of turn things on and off, and you can turn all of them off, and all you will see is a transparent layer, and then you can turn them on as needed. Okay. So that was just kind of a preview of the layers panel, because we're going to be in the layers panel quite a bit tonight. And then the last thing about the layers panels, you do have some options down here as well. So if I wanted to delete something like the sunset filter, I can take it and I can throw it in the little trash bin down here. But if I wanted to delete, say, the squiggle, you can also hit delete or backspace on your keyboard and it will delete it as well. If I wanted to create a new empty layer, say I'm going to add like makeup, or I'm going to add some type of coloring or a shape or something like that, I can create a new layer here next to the trash can. And that will give me an empty layer named layer 1, and I can go ahead and double click that and type in makeup if that's what I was doing on there, or if I was doing the eyes, adding like an effect to the eyes or something like that. You can also create groups. The third method is also to select your layers and bring them down to that little folder, and that will also create a group. The next ones over are going to be effects. So we have some gradients, we have brightness and contrast, and we have all these effects right here that are also mirrored in your adjustments panel. So in your adjustments panel, you have these 3 rows of adjustments that you can make. And these are all masks. So that's what we're going to talk about next, is masks. So a mask is basically, in Photoshop, a mask is basically what it sounds like. You're putting on a mask and you're kind of covering some things up, or you're revealing some things. So a mask can either cover up or it can reveal. So if I wanted to change brightness and contrast, or if I wanted to play around with the levels and exposure on this image and things like that, I'm going to select this top row to do things like that. If I'm going to be working on the color or anything color correction wise, we're probably going to be looking at the second row right here. So you can change hue and saturation, you can color balance, you can make things black and white, you have some photo filters available, you can start playing around with the channels, and then you have color lookup tables, which are basically kind of like filters. And then your third row is going to be really effects. So you're going to be able to invert the colors. You're going to be able to posterize something and things like that. So if I add, let's say, a hue and saturation layer on top of here. As you can see, it creates a new layer on top of everything, and it's going to create it on top of the layer that I had last selected, or if I have nothing selected, it's going to put it right at the top. So if I wanted to affect this layer, but not this group, then I would need to select this layer, go to my adjustments panel, and select the type of layer that I want to put above it. So that way it'll only affect everything below it and nothing above it. You can also link these to specific layers. So if I wanted to affect only the layer below it, but if there was 3 or 4 layers down here and I didn't want those to be affected, I can link this to this in 2 different ways. There's this little guy right here, which is the link. So as you can see, it points an arrow down. I'm going to undo that real quick. If I click on the options of this layer, which, oh yeah, I'm sorry, it usually pops up a flyout window. It's popping it up right here. So usually I see it over here. So that's the method number 1, which is to link it down below. And number 2 is if you hold down your Option or Alt key between the layers and then click, it's also going to create that link to the layer below. So now if I make some changes, I'm going to go up to this layer and I'm going to make some changes. So right now I've got it set to the default preset, and there are some presets here that you can play around with. And we have it set to master, which means it's going to affect every color spectrum, or you can select a specific color spectrum. So I'm going to leave it in master. And then I'm going to just kind of play around with this. So I can give him purple skin, or I can make him very green with envy. So let's make him green with envy. But say I wanted to affect only his skin and I don't want it to affect the rest of the image. As you can see, we're seeing some green up here. We're seeing some green in the shirt as well. If I don't want to affect anything else, I would want to invert this mask, because with white, I'm revealing the effect that I have applied. With black, I am hiding the effect, but I can paint it back on with white. So I'm going to click on the mask, and you have 2 separate little things when you are playing around with masks. You'll either have the image itself, or you'll have the effect that you're working with. So that will, get you into those properties. And then you have the actual mask itself, which is right here. So I am going to invert it, I'm going to do Command keyboard, shortcut Command and I. So now it changes it to black. So now I have a black mask that is hiding the effect. And if I want to reveal it, I will take a brush and I will make sure that my color, my foreground color is set to white. And then I can start brushing that effect specifically in the areas that I want to brush it on. So if I want to just brush it on his face and skin and things like that, I can target specific areas that I want to change. And that will allow you to make these type of very precise changes to skin color, to eye color, to hair color, to just about anything. You also have the ability to blend these pixels with the layer that you're affecting by going to the blend modes. And you can go to the blend modes and kind of play around with them, and you see that they make some very funky choices. So this first section is all going to be about working with the darker pixels in your image and darkening them further. This second section is all about lightening your pixels, so working with the lighter pixels and the highlights and then making changes to those. The third section is kind of like transparency set over the image, and it's going to mix it in various different ways. And then the next section is all going to be about dividing, about absolutely going on an invert or deleting pixels. So that's going to do that. And then everything with color and luminosity is going to be down here. And, you know, this is all about playing around with things. So you can definitely go in here and play around with your blend modes and see what they do. And then you also have the ability to play with the opacity. So if I, you know, chose this very dark, almost army color, but I didn't want to be very evident, I can bring down the opacity quite a bit so that it just makes like this little shadow. So you can easily create bruises, you can create makeup looks, you can do all kinds of things. You can turn somebody into Frankenstein. So there's a lot of room to play around. You can take a portrait and make it very, you know, you can make it very artistic. So there's a lot of ways to play around with your portraits. And so that's how masks are. You want to be able to either reveal things or you want to be able to hide things. And you're going to make the choice of what the mask color should be by how much you have to reveal or where the effect really needs to be applied. If it needs to be applied to a large section of the image, so if I do Command and I, set it back to white, say I wanted to, you know, affect a large portion of the image, then I would want my mask to be white. Otherwise, I'm going to spend hours painting. So then I'm only going to erase it from the areas, sorry, wrong one, from the areas that I want. Like, for example, making him human again, like just kind of going hulky a little bit. So, you know, you definitely want to be able to target just the specific areas that you want. So the choice of the mask color is going to differentiate how much work you have to do, really. So moving on, we're going to start kind of going into the workflow. So I'm going to close down this image and open one up from scratch so we can go straight into Camera Raw, and I can tell you a couple of things about Camera Raw, and then we'll start making some edits. I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm not going to save it because I really don't want to make him look that way. And then, you know, depending on how you like to work and depending on how much real estate you have, you can really, you know, I tend to have like my Photoshop window open, and I like to have a section of the desktop available. So I usually put either a folder with the files that I'm working with on the desktop, or I may have my, you know, hard drive or flash drive connected, and that way I can work off of that hard drive or flash drive, and I can access it pretty easily. Otherwise, you can open up a new image in several different ways. Number one, you would go to File and Open. Number two, you have this open right here. And number three, you can go to the file that you have and you can select an image. So I have no idea which one's which, but I'm just gonna kind of select one, right click it, and then go open with Photoshop. And by default, our computers are set to open with Photoshop. So this is another image that we're gonna kind of take a look at. And as you can see, it didn't open it into that Photoshop environment because this is a raw file. So images that are raw usually tend to open into this raw format. And you can make changes here right away. For example, you have a color picker that allows you to white balance. So this is your white balance tool. And the way that you use this is you can either select something that is gray, which I have a lot of gray here, or select something that is white. So if I take this and I kind of color pick right there, it's going to make the adjustment for me. As you can see, it kind of moves things around right here. And there you can kind of eyeball it a little bit, unless you had you took this image and you had a color card in it at the same time. You're going to kind of try to remember what the colors look like. And this is pretty accurate. I may like to warm it up just a tiny bit, just to warm up her skin a little bit. But overall, I'm not going to change the white balance a lot because I did try to white balance when I took this image. And then you have a bunch of sliders. So this is this first tab right here, which is all the basic controls. And I'm going to be able to change exposure, contrast. I'm going to be able to work specifically with my highlights, specifically with my shadows, affect just whites, affect just blacks, texture, clarity, which is either going to make things very textured or very soft. And then this is more, dehaze is going to be more for landscape, like if there's mist or things like that. That's what would kind of clear that up a little bit. And then you have vibrance and saturation. So a lot of people tend to have problems with this one, and vibrance kind of can pick colors in your image that are very prevalent and emphasize them more versus saturation, which would oversaturate all your colors or desaturate all your colors. So if I slide backwards, it's going to give me a grayscale image. If I slide forwards, it's going to give me this really, really funky skin tone. And then if I double click that arrow or any of the arrows, it'll set it back to 0. With vibrance, it's just going to look for the tones that are more prevalent in the image. So as you can see, as I get to 100%, it is not as insane as the other, as saturation. So it's just going to emphasize the colors that are very prevalent, which sometimes, you know, you just need a little tiny touch. So with exposure, you know, I usually like to go in down here where the zoom level is and go to 100%. And then I'm going to hold or either go to the hand or hold on my space bar if I'm on another tool and just kind of look at their face, because that's exactly what we're, you know, dealing with is with the portrait is the face, it's the eyes, it's everything. And I want to see how my exposure is. I don't have like very, very strong shadows other than the one right here by her collar, because the collar created that shadow. And I don't have highlights that are so blown out that, you know, half of her face is white, which is really what you want to get to. But sometimes you do like to have that high contrast, which is, you know, an artistic choice. So do I need more exposure? I really don't. If I want to, I can add just a tiny touch. A lot of these sliders are you know, just a touch will go a very long way. And then I have my highlights. So if I want to bring down those highlights a little bit, I can, but as you can see, it sometimes makes them even more evident. So I'm just going to leave that alone a little bit. And then the shadows, if you look at this section here, if I go to the right, it's going to brighten up that section because it's just looking at the shadows or anything that is in the shadows. And if I pull towards the left, it deepens those shadows, and here we get almost black. So this is where you would start kind of playing around and getting some various tones. So with this one, I'm gonna just deepen the shadows a tiny, tiny bit. And then you have your whites, which again is gonna almost like add exposure, but it's more like adding gain and like really bringing up your whites that are right here, your whites values. And then you have your blacks. Well, in this image, she's wearing black. You always have to take into consideration what the person is wearing, what the background looks like, because, you know, we try to look at the histogram and, you know, look at what it should look like, you know, all even and nice tones and everything. But if your image is prevalently gray and dark colors, that's why all my color values are skewed, or all my values in my histogram are skewed towards the darker colors because there's very little brights in here. So this is where sometimes your histogram fails you, because this image doesn't need me to overexpose it to get, you know, my exposure all the way over here or my whites all the way over here, because I don't have a lot of white. The only whites that we really have are her teeth and her eyes, and even that isn't true white on anybody. So I'm not going to play around too much with the blacks and the whites. So if I pull in the blacks, it's just going to add more color to the black of her clothing and anything dark in the image. And if I pull toward the right, it's going to make them look more faded and more gray. So I may just pull a tiny bit to the left to deepen a little bit of the color in her clothing, but I don't want to deepen it so much that there's no difference in highlight and shadow in her clothing. And then we have texture. So if I go up high, it's going to create a lot of texture, especially around the skin. So I'm going to pull this down, and I'm going to go back to 0 so you can see the big difference that it made. So if I go towards the right, it's creating a lot of contrast in the smaller pixels and creating texture. Now, if she was, you know, if this was like a sports or action shot, or she's in the mud or something like that, that might emphasize that look and add texture to it. But if it's a portrait where I'm trying to make someone look, you know, their best, their Sunday best, then I don't want to add a ton more texture. I actually am going to leave that slider completely alone. And then clarity also kind of does the same thing. It's going to add more texture, but at the same time, it's going to add a little bit of grit. And then it's going to really sharpen all the edges of your pixels is what it's going to do. And then on the opposite end, it's going to soften everything. So if I wanted to get rid of all her pores, then that's the way to kind of do it. But there's easier or more subtle methods to do so inside of Photoshop. So we don't want to do that here. So I will not play around with that. So basically, even though I have a ton of control here, I'm only going to make very subtle changes. And that all depends on the image that you start with. Sometimes you need to make a few more changes, but I would be more subtle about it because you can make those changes in Photoshop. So now if you click done, it's basically going to close the image out. Most people always click done and then they're like, wait, where'd my image go? What you need to do is click open image. So when we open the image, it's going to actually open it in Photoshop. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of this layer. And the reason that I do that is even though Photoshop is a non-destructive editing program for images, meaning that it doesn't take the original file and write over it unless you tell Photoshop to do so, I like having an image that is completely clean or as clean as possible. That's why I don't make a ton of changes in Camera Raw, to kind of look back to see how far have I gone? Do I need to go a little further, or did I go too far and maybe I need to kind of backtrack a little bit? So I always like having the original at the bottom of my layers just to kind of compare to what I've done. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and hit duplicate layer, and I'm just going to call this copy and hit that. The next technique that we're going to cover is called frequency separation. So this is a really geeky technical term for what we're going to do is split our image into two separate kind of frequencies or image frequencies. What we want to do is put all the texture content into one layer and then put all the like color and tone content into a separate layer so that we can affect the skin separately. And it's going to allow you to perfect the skin in a much subtler and much better way. It's going to look so much smoother and so much better than going in and attacking it with, you know, your healing tool, though we are going to be using it. So basically, we're going to put the high frequencies or the texture on one layer, and then we're going to put the low frequencies and tones and color on another layer. So to do that, even though I made a copy, I'm going to make one more copy. And then I'm going to rename both of these. So I'm going to call this texture. And I'm going to call this color. Now you can name these whatever you want. I just like naming them texture and color because I know where things are. So what I'm going to do is with my color layer, the first thing I'm going to do is go to filter and go down to blur. And then we're going to select the Gaussian blur. Okay. Now she's very young, so she's got very nice skin to begin with. So I don't think that I'll be having to do a lot of work, but either way, I usually try not to blur an image way too much. So I usually stay between 1 and 2 pixels. I've seen people pull up to 4 or 5 pixels, and that's choice, but I like to stay somewhere around 1.6, 1.7. With her, I'm probably going to stick around 1.2. And basically what I'm looking for, and I'm kind of looking at specifically her skin, her and her face, and I usually tend to target the cheek area, is that it's soft and that I don't see a ton of texture. I don't want to lose all the texture, but I do want to get rid of most of it. So then I'm going to hit OK to accept those changes. And with our top layer, so as you can see, if I turn off that eyeball, and I'm going to go to my view and zoom settings, and I'm going to go to 100% so we can see this at 100%. I'm going to move this down a little bit. this is the blurred image. So, sorry. So we can see that the texture is gone. We see that we've got very soft eyes, very soft skin, and things like that. If I turn on my texture layer, then I can see all the detail again. But to our texture layer, we are going to do something to it as well. And what we're going to do is something that somebody figured out. I have no idea how they figured this out, or if, you know, Photoshop kind of said, hey, you should do this. And that's how they figured it out. But what you're going to do is you're going to go up to your image menu, and you're going to go down to something called apply image. So when you apply an image, it's basically going to apply either a merged copy, or you can apply specific layers into a new layer, but we're going to keep it within the same layer. So what we want to do is take our color layer. Okay, so the layer that we're kind of working with is the color layer. And then we're going to blend it, but we're going to subtract. Okay. And then you're going to set your scale to 2 and your offset to 128. And you're going to get something that looks like this. Okay, so you're going to see a little bit of detail. You're going to see a little, you're basically going to see the harder edges of the detail in your image. And then if we hit OK, we're going to have this gray texture layer. Now we need to blend it with the rest of our image by going down to hard light. And let me double check that because I sometimes do that wrong. Yes, hard light. So basically, you can see that we have our blurred texture, and then we have our blurred layer for the color, and we have our texture up top. So now we can use 2 separate tools, and I'm going to group these layers by right-clicking and hitting group layers. And I like to call them FQ separation or FQ sep. So I know that's where I did that. And you can kind of still see your layers, but I like grouping them because that way I can just kind of do what I need to do, and then I can kind of drop them down that way so I don't have to see everything. So number one, I always kind of use either our zoom if you go to view, and I usually set it to 100, which I do have it set to 100 right now. If you go to like 200, you're starting to see pixelation or anything beyond that. And you're gonna start to see like the pixels, and I don't, you know, sometimes you really don't need to see it. I prefer being at 100. I'm looking at 100% of the pixels, and I can see the detail that I need to see. Sometimes you do have to zoom in if you're doing detail work, like if I was going around the eyes and things like that, I would definitely do that. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to take, and somebody played around with these, so I gotta double check where my, here we go. It's gonna be under here. So we're going to take our spot healing brush tool. And let me double check because I have to use, there are 2 of them that are, okay, so it's gonna be the other one. Now I'm going to zoom in for a second real quick. Sorry. Just to double check. Okay, so it is this one. Because there's 2 different tools on here that are very similar. So I just want to make sure that I'm using the right tool, and I used the wrong keyboard shortcut right there. And we're at 100%. Okay, so basically you're going to use your little spot healing brush tool. But number one, when you are going to be using this, I prefer not to use it with a hard edge. So I usually bring my edge way down to 0 again. And that's because if I use it with a hard edge, you're going to see the detail around where I'm kind of working with. And if you don't, if it's feathered and soft, it'll blend the pixels a little better. At least that's how I feel. So basically, you're just going to go over areas where there's a lot of texture and you want to get rid of some of that texture. And then we're going to smooth everything out with our color layer. And even though it may not look like it's doing much, it actually is. And like I said, with her skin, she really doesn't need a lot of work. So we would go in here and just make some minimal changes to those sections where we feel there's maybe too much texture. And I'm just kind of doing this pretty fast right now. You would rather take your time doing this section. And I'm going so fast that Photoshop started having a hard time with me. All right, so once you've kind of gone in and kind of looked at those areas where there's, you know, a little bit more texture than you want, and you kind of smooth them out a little bit, you're going to go down to your color layer. And this is where things kind of take a side turn and things get really nice. But you're going to switch tools. So you're going to go to the healing brush tool. So the healing brush tool works much like the spot healing brush tool, in that it kind of blends things around. And again, I want to work with a soft brush, not a hard brush. So I'm going to make sure that the hardness is all the way down. And number two is you do have to tell it where to target. As you can see, because I accidentally clicked, it's telling me, hey, you need to click a source of where the target is. So you can go to, you can hold down Option or Alt on your PC and decide on an area that you kind of want to copy. And what you're looking for here is to smooth out like color differences. So for example, here around this blemish, it gets darker. So what I want to do is take some of the tones around it and blend it out. So I'm going to hold down my Option key and I'm going to target that area, and then I'm going to start to move around. And then I'm going to start to really blend in these colors and kind of make her skin as smooth as possible. This can take quite a bit of time, and you do want to take your time. Like right now I made my brush pretty big, which I shouldn't have. This is more detailed work that you want to do because you want to really take your time and blend these colors out so that her skin looks fantastic. And we're going to blend the tones. So as we do that, you can see that we're making changes to the texture as well, or it seems like it, but basically what we're doing is we're blending those tones out. And this will also kind of calm down some of these highlights right here if I select from here and start kind of going over here. But be careful as you get to edges like this. As you can see, I went a little too far, and now she's got this like really dark spot right here. So if I undo, I can go here and just be a little more subtle. So that's why you don't want to have a large brush, because when you start getting into areas where the color tone is very different, it's just going to muddy things up. So basically what you're looking for is to really kind of soften the detail even further with this effect. And, you know, you want to take your time. I am going very fast because we don't have unlimited time tonight. But you know, you want to take your time, in little sections at a time is better. So if I go through here and just kind of smooth things out, this is really going to help with texture. And this is where people's pores start to disappear. So I'm going a little too far and too fast. See, we got about 45 minutes left, so I can do a little bit more. And if there's any questions, again, you can go ahead and pop them into the Q&A, and Jeff or Patrick will announce them to me and I can kind of answer them, and they can be about anything in Photoshop. Or if you didn't understand something and you would like me to reiterate it or re-explain it, I can do so as well. Areas that you really want to be careful when you're doing this is areas that have hard edges. So like, you know, between her mouth and her teeth, obviously you don't want to do anything right here because you're going to be getting rid of the texture and basically just creating a blurry mess, or around the edges of her face, you know, anything right here like her laugh line. As I try to kind of smooth out things, I could create more issues than not. So you want to take a look at those areas and be careful as you move around them. So as we continue, we'll do that a little bit. And then usually after I've, see, sometimes you like it and sometimes you don't. After I've done a little bit of this, I usually like to kind of turn these layers off and see where I started. So that's why it's good to have them grouped. So now I can kind of look back and look forward. And you know, it's subtle. You don't really notice it as you're working with it, but then that's why I like having that original layer, because then you can really see, oh my God, I like totally changed the look of her face, you know. And sometimes it can be too much and you can think, oh, I should back off a little bit. And that's where you can kind of back off with your opacity. So if I bring that opacity all the way to 0, then obviously it's transparent. But if I bring it up, then it's not as evident as at 100%. So this is when you start to kind of really play and get artsy with the skin and kind of, you know, make it look exactly like you want to. So if I go back to my color layer, I want to fix this a little bit. So she's got a lot of darker tones here. And so I can kind of smooth these out. And you want to be careful the colors that you pick up because it will mix them. So for example, here she's got this like very light spot, and then some darker spots. And we all have like light and darker spots. We have reddish. You know, skin is all types of colors. It's not just one skin tone. So as we kind of look around, we just kind of play around with that. And you can do that all throughout the skin, even the neck. Sometimes I do the neck as well. Sometimes the hands, depending on the person or the age of the person as well. They're gonna, as we get older, we get more texture, and sometimes we get, I was working on a portrait where the gentleman had, he had had an IV in recently, and there was a lot of bruising on his hands. So I had to go in and kind of color correct that and blend it all out. So, you know, you really want to kind of spend some time looking around at all the skin that is visible, and you want to see where you can make adjustments, where can you kind of smooth things out, even things out, and make the person look their best. If that's the look we're going for. Again, you are always gonna kind of select what the look is prior to going in there and doing that. And for example, she's got very minimal makeup on. I can go in and give her full on makeup. I can change the color of her lipstick, and we're gonna do a little bit of that. The next thing I want to talk about is color correcting for red skin. So I may have to open another image up real quick. Let me take a look. A lot of us, me included, get very red. I tend to get very red, especially in the summer. And so I get like a red nose, or let's work with the first one that we had opened. I get like a really red nose sometimes, or, you know, I just tend to get red and splotchy. So when that happens, sometimes you need to, and let me see how red he is. Let's take a quick look. Not too bad, but you see we have some red splotchiness here, and we have some red here. And color correcting red is such a challenge sometimes, but there is a couple things that you can do to minimize that red. And what we want to do is, usually if I was working in my, this portrait, if I was working on this portrait and I had already done all my frequency separation, so I'd worked on a skin, I'd made sure that it was blended as well as I could, gotten rid of whatever it was that I wanted to get rid of, whether it was age lines, spots, or, you know, blemishes or anything like that. Once I've completed that, I would make a new copy. So I'm going to go back to this, so just to show you what I mean. So instead of making a copy of my background, because let's face it, that's not what I need right now, I want to make a copy of these two on one single layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a blank layer, and then I am going to go back up here to image and go to apply image. But instead of telling it to subtract, I'm just going to go to normal, and it's going to merge all the layers beneath it into one. So basically I get a new copy of my layer. So that's what I would do if I was going to start correcting for redness, or if I was going to start adding effects like makeup or changing, eye color or things like that. So that way I have a new copy to work with. And so I'm going to go to this one, and I'm going to go to my adjustments. So what I want to do is I want to correct a little bit of that red. And this can be so nerve-wracking for me sometimes, because sometimes it works really great and sometimes it just really doesn't, because red doesn't come out very well. If you've ever gotten wine in something or lipstick on something, you know that red does not come out. So what we want to do is we want to affect the layer below. So that's great because we're looking at the layer below. But instead of doing the master, we want to look at our reds. Okay. And basically, and I'm going to bring this down so you can see what we're looking at. So we're looking at the section here. We're looking all the way to these fuchsia pink colors and all the way to these yellow tones. Now, we don't need to affect every red, because then we would affect every single part of a skin color, because there's some yellows and some oranges in our skin and things like that. So what I do first of all is I put the saturation all the way up to 100. And that shows me all the reds it's targeting. So it's even targeting reds that are in the background. It's targeting reds that are reflected onto his shirt and things like that. I don't want to affect every one of these hues. What I want to target is these areas here. The nose where I saw some red, there was some red here in this area as well. So basically, I'm going to first kind of slide these first ones in, and then I'm going to slide the outer ones in till I get to those areas. And you may still get a little bit of the other areas, but at least it won't be as much. So now that I've have the areas that I really want to target, I'm going to set this back to 0. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the hue towards the blue. And I'm not going to pull it so far that I get green, but I'm going to pull it, I usually pull probably about 5 to 8. So depending on how red the person is. And sometimes you're going to get rid of all the red and sometimes you're not. And this one, we were able to get rid of almost all the red, and you will see that how evident that is. So all that red that was here in this section and most of this red is now gone because we have pulled the hues and more into the yellow and the blue and balance them out. You do have to be careful because it will change all the hues and tones that you're looking at in the spectrum. So you want to be very careful, but it is a mask. So you have the ability to really target it where you want. For example, I see that it also took a lot of the red in the lips, and that's because we have more pigment, more red pigment in our lips for the most part. So what I can do is clean it up with a brush by going here and bringing back that red detail in the lip area. Now, obviously, I just kind of did it sloppily, but I can go in and really like just select that area. Or if there's some, if he had or she had red makeup on or something like that, you're going to affect those reds. So you may have to bring those back. But thankfully we can because it is a mask. So that is how you're going to kind of color correct your reds or any type of hue that is very evident. Somebody may be wearing a very green shirt and it's all of a sudden reflecting in their skin. You can try to hide that greenish hue in the skin by pulling more red into the image. So you always kind of go to the opposite color. So the reds, we're going to pull more into the blues. If it was green, we're going to pull more into the warm colors. So you're basically working on opposite color spectrums to correct. So let's go back to our other headshot. And then once I'm done correcting those reds, then I start to kind of look at where I can make even more adjustments and where I want to, you know, correct things or change things or add things. So this is where you have the ability to get creative. Okay. And getting creative can be anything from just, you know, making their eyes more vibrant or, you know, correcting for the teeth, which actually with her, she's got pretty white teeth. So I wouldn't make her teeth like super bright, but someone older may have a smile that has a little bit of yellowing in the teeth. And then you can also use that adjustment, the hue and saturation, you can correct for the yellows as well. So if I go to here, you can also select like the yellows, and then that's where you would target just that area. And you know, usually with the yellows, instead of changing them to a different hue because I want to get rid of them, what I do is I bring the saturation down of the yellows. So then they kind of go almost grayscale, and then you can brighten them with the lightness right here. So I'll do that just to illustrate, but it's not really necessary for her. So if I take the saturation down, as you can see, now she's got silver hair. And then I brighten. Okay, so now her teeth are fairly white, but again, I don't want to add this to everything. I just want to affect the teeth. So I'm going to invert my mask by doing Command and I or Control and I on a PC. And then I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to make it a lot smaller because I don't want to get into her lips. And then I'm going to make sure that my color is white instead of the black. You can do that by hitting this little switch right here, or you can also do it by your keyboard, just X will flip back and forth between the two. So then I can go here and just affect her teeth. So now we're kind of making her teeth very, 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 very bright. And you can do that to the eyes too. Now here's where I would zoom in, especially on the eye area. You don't want to use big brushes. So if I go here and kind of try to get rid of some of that maybe yellowing in the eyes, but as you can see, it sometimes changes because we're taking away the saturation of the yellows. It might make things look a little muddy and gray. So be careful, you know, with this one. I only use it really for the teeth. I usually don't use it on the eyes. On the eyes, I tend to either add a brightening effect or something like that to change things. So I'm going to zoom back out a tiny bit, go back to 100%. So now we can kind of start looking at what we want to do. There's another technique that can be used to kind of even out skin color, which uses a gradient map. So what you want to do, I'm going to delete this real quick. So I have this copy of my layers, and usually when I'm done with each step, I start making more of these copies to work off of. So that way I'm not you know, I have something to work on. Sometimes you just need an empty layer, but for this one, I need something underneath to work on. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer. Okay, and this is basically to even out skin tone further. But this is an effect that you really want to take your time with, because if you don't, it's going to look really, really weird. So number one, what you want to do is you want to take your brush tool here. And then what we want to do is, if we go to, let me remember real quick. Okay, so there it is. So first we want to change this to from point sample to 5x5. So it kind of looks at not just that one single area, but it looks at the kind of area around it. And basically what I want to do is select from the highlights from the midtones and from the shadows. So I usually look at the areas that are highlighted, at the areas that are midtone, which usually tend to be the cheeks unless you've got a really bright light. So like I would look at this cheek instead of this cheek right now. And then the shadows. So you don't want to pick the really super dark black shadow. You want to pick where the skin is kind of shadowed but not black. So first I'm going to select the highlight, and then I'm going to go back to my brush, and I'm on an empty layer. I'm going to make my brush really big, and I'm going to pop in the color right there just to have a sample of it. I'm going to go back to my sampling tool, and I'm going to go to my midtones. So that's her cheek area. So if I go back to my brush, now I have my midtones right there. And then I'm going to go back to my sampling tool, and I'm going to select the shadows and go back to my brush. And now I have my shadows. So I have these three separate colors that I can use to kind of even out her skin tone. And the way to do so is we're going to create a gradient map of these colors. So we have the ability to create a gradient map, and a gradient map adds color to a specific targeted area or to your highlights and your shadows. But basically it's going to target those colors to various sections. So what I want to do is I want to create a layer with my gradient map, and it's going to take the darkest color or the color that was last selected and then mix it with white. But that's not what I want to do. I want to double click inside here to bring up the gradient editor. So what I want to do is, first of all, I'm going to kind of, before I go there, I'm going to kind of turn off this layer because I don't want to see it right now. But I do want to see the options. So I usually like turning it off because when it's on, you are getting like a filter on top of these colors and it changes them, and you don't want to do that. So basically it goes from dark to light. So our darkest color is kind of picked, and we're kind of looking for two things. One, we're looking for the color, but the second thing we want to look at is the information here. So if we open this up, we have our color information here. And we are going to be looking for, where is it? My luminance values. Sorry. Not 28. I'm gonna look at 88 because it's got the most reds in here. So 88. So basically we'll go in here, we'll target this, and then we'll put a location of 88. So it's going to bring it all the way up here. Well, actually, it should probably be, yeah, I was looking at the wrong number, so it's 33. Okay. And then we're gonna add a new one in the center. So I actually changed that accidentally. I'm gonna do that and then do 35. 35, around there. And then I want to add a new one. There we go. So I accidentally clicked in it. And we want to get the middle color. Okay. And this one is set at 58. So we're going to set it to 58. And then we're going to look at our brightest color pick it, and that's at 87. So we're going to set the location to 87. Now, sometimes you still kind of have to mix these a little bit. Even though we set the locations, they're approximations of where those dark values are, but I tend to slide around a little bit. Sometimes I kind of pull more towards the lighter side, so that, especially like with her portrait, there isn't a lot of shadow information. So we don't absolutely need all this shadow information. So I kind of pull it a little more towards the lighter side because there's more midtones and highlights in her skin than there is shadows. So now if I hit OK, and I bring this back up, now we've got all this color information. But what we want to do is we want to set our blend mode to color. And then we want to bring our opacity down quite a bit, okay? Now, the thing about this is that it is a filter, so it is going to apply it to everything. It is a mask, I should say. So it's going to apply it to everything. You want to only apply it to the skin. So this is where your brushing technique or your selections come into play. You can select all the skin by playing around with the selection tools and getting just the skin, or you can go in and paint the areas that you want to paint. For tonight, I'm just going to paint the areas that I want to paint. So I am going to invert my mask, and then I'm going to take my brush tool so you can see it, because I want to see half and half, so you guys can see half of her face with this effect on and half of it with it off. So I'm going to paint it in this area here, and I'm doing so fairly sloppily because we're running out of time, but basically it's going to smooth out some of those tones, and it's subtle. It's not like, oh my God, this is, you know, amazing, but it's subtle enough that it makes, you know, a difference. And it gives you just a little bit of smoothness to that skin tone. Now, if I have the opacity set all the way high, you're going to see it like this. And that's not what we want it to look like. We want it to blend nicely and evenly. So you can set the opacity to whatever you want. I tend to stay around in the teens. Sometimes, you know, if it's an area that really needs some attention, I may go into the 20s and the 30s, but in the teens usually gives you just a subtle amount that you need to kind of even out some of the skin tones. You don't need to make her look, you know, like this. um, so now let's talk about adding some filters, adding some makeup, adding, you know, different colors and things like that. So you can do it in various ways. You can, I'm gonna turn this off real quick. No, actually, I'm just gonna get rid of it for now. Say I wanted to give her a little bit of blush, I can add an empty layer. I can select, I don't know, let's see. She's wearing dark. Let's just go with a pastel yellow. I'm gonna make my brush a lot smaller, and I'm actually going to get in here a little bit. So I can go in here and kind of, you know, you're gonna do this delicately. I am doing this not so delicately. So you really want to take your time doing some of these things. I am not taking my time, so you want to be more careful. And sharp edges are never your friend when you're adding makeup and things like that. But basically, if you add a color, okay, so right now I've just basically painted with like a crayon on her face. But if I blend it, and this is where you start to play around, you know, you can deepen the color, okay? You can lighten the color and mix it in various ways. You can go to overlay, soft light, and things like that. If I go to soft light and then I kind of bring down the opacity a little bit, and I just kind of blend that out a little bit with, you know, some feathering and things like that. If I adjust the mask, well, if I add a mask to this and adjust it, view properties, there you go. I can feather the mask out further, so it'll be kind of a very soft edge and things like that. You can create these very beautiful makeup looks that look natural, like right here. Obviously sharp edges, as I said, are not your friend in Photoshop, but you know, you can play around with it. It can give her all kinds of looks, like if I was a makeup artist. I can also contour her face in various ways. So, you know, if you're familiar with makeup, there are ways to kind of deepen the shadows of your skin and, you know, add highlight to sections of your skin to make your skin look more flawless. Not that I'm great with that, but in Photoshop, I can do it very well. And the way that I would do that is on top of whatever layer that I'm going to do this like kind of 3D contour effect, is I would add an empty layer. And then I'm going to fill it. So I'm going to go to my edit menu and I'm going to go to fill. And then you have the contents. What do you want to fill it with? Well, I don't want a pattern. I actually want 50% gray. So if I go to 50% gray and hit OK and leave the blending mode in normal here, you're going to hit OK. And as you can see, we can see that little section of eyeshadow because it's above it. So I'm going to turn it off for now. But I will set the blend mode here specifically to soft light. Okay, so now I have this empty layer of gray pixels that I can play around with. And what I'm going to use is my dodge and burn tool. So dodging is going to increase the kind of gain, or it's not really exposure of your pixels, but it's kind of adding more exposure to it. So it's gaining on it. So it's always going to target by default your midtones. You can select shadows or highlights depending on what you're doing. Most of the time I leave it at midtones because I'm usually affecting skin. And then you have your exposure at 50%. That's a lot. So I will demonstrate. If I go 50%, it's not as evident right there, but it is quite a bit. You want to be more subtle with this. I keep doing the wrong keyboard shortcut. So right here is where I kind of swiped across her face. As you can see that. You want to be more subtle with it. So one, I'm going to undo it. So I usually bring my exposure down to the 20s, 30s, 25, somewhere around there. And then I start to paint the area. So this dodging is going to add more highlights. So what I want to do is highlight the T-zone of her face. So kind of this area here, down her nose, okay, to the tip of her nose. And every time you brush, it's going to add more and more. This is an additive effect. So I can continue adding until it's almost white. That's not what you want to do. You want to be subtle with it. So I just want to do maybe one more. And then I'm going to do a little section here on her chin, maybe. You can even do the lips. So this is basically, you're just kind of emphasizing some of those highlight areas and deepening some of those shadows. So I can kind of go to this area here too, around her brow, on both sides, and even above it. And I'm doing it very sloppily, but it's still doing it. You can even go underneath the eyes as well and kind of brighten this area here. Great for dark circles. And just kind of add a little bit of highlight. I'm going to back out a little bit here. Okay, so as you can see, we're adding like this very highlighty effect. And right now I have it set to 100%, so it's really, really highlight. And then we would switch to our burn tool. So our burn tool is the opposite. It's actually going to deepen and create more shadow. So at 50%, this one is very evident, as you can see right there. So again, I like working with this down in the 20s. And then I'm going to go around the areas where there should be more shadow. And so I hit those opposite areas of where I just added some color. So I'm going to go down the side of her nose. And obviously, you really want to take your time with this. I'm not taking my time. So you want to deepen certain sections. You don't want to deepen under the eyes because you're just going to give her dark circles, but you do want to go down the side of the nose. You may want to go underneath the nose right by the nostrils. You may also want to do down the side of the neck sometimes just to create depth and dimension, or around the collarbones if the collarbones are around. So this is basically going to give it somewhat of a 3D-ish effect because you're kind of deepening certain areas and you're highlighting certain areas. And if it's too much, what do? We go to our opacity and we bring it down to where we like it. something that isn't so scary. You know, you'd never want to be scary with these things, but you do want to play around with it. And so you can play around with this. It's an effect that works fairly well, just dodging and burning. And if you, you know, if you have trouble with this, you can definitely look up videos on YouTube on dodging and burning for skin, or even for clothes. You can use it for clothes. You can use it for anything. And you can just play around with it and create these new looks and, you know, add more dimension to your images by just deepening certain areas and bringing out certain areas. So that's basically what you're going to do. And then also, you know, you can use filters. So filters can be used in various different ways, or you can create your own filters. So if I wanted to do something with the gradient map, I can do that as well. You know, something very different, like, you know, you can create that duotone effect. So I can go here and create something like that with maybe a purple, you know, and then you can bring the opacity down, or you can blend it. This is where you start to play, you know. You can kind of go around here and really add some different colors. So this is where you start to kind of play around. And since they're all masks, you can target specific areas. You can add it just to the background, or you can add it to the overall look. If you're starting to tailor a very cinematic look, you know, you can definitely do that. And why doesn't fit on screen? For some reason that wasn't working. So as you can see, you can really target various areas, or you can create a whole look. You also have your color lookup tables. So these are already pre-made kind of filters, so you can kind of play around with these. So like if I do edgy amber, okay, so this is like a really, really intense look, and I can go around and play with the blend modes as well here, you know, and this will give it like this faded, aged look. And then I can bring down the opacity to what I want to just add that little bit of tiny warmth back into my image. So, you know, and these, you can add 20 of these, you can add 30 of these. You can target specific areas like just her clothes, or just the background, or just her hair, or the skin. So you can go ahead and target those with, you know, painting the effect on or taking it off and things like that. But you can build very crazy looks and very crazy libraries of your color lookup tables and gradient maps to create various looks. You can even work with empty layers. So I'm going to delete this layer real quick. But say I create an empty layer and I grab my brush, or you can, you know, if you have like effect brushes, those are really great. And I'm going to make this brush super big, very big. And then I'm going to grab some color. So I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to go to a different color like here. And then let's drop some purple there. And then let's deepen things up in the center. And then let's add some reds. And you can really play with this, right? So now I've got this empty layer with all these colors. And then again, I can go through my blend modes and see what I want to do with this. What do I like, you know? Something, I love soft light. I always, almost all the time, blend with soft light. I just love the way it blends things. But you can go to all these various different things. You know, you may like something completely different than what I like. So let's try divide. And then we can bring down our opacity, and then we're just adding a little bit of color here and there. So you can create your own crazy filters. You can create your own makeup looks. You can go online and find makeup brushes. Like there's brushes that are just for eyelashes that actually add eyelashes to people that have short eyelashes. You can find eyebrows. You can find all kinds of things, even eye brushes where it has like the iris, the pupil, and everything. So you can even do that. So like if I go into her eyes, so I'm going to turn off some of these really quickly. And then I'm going to go zoom in pretty far. And I have two different ways that I can change eyes. I can add an empty layer, and I have my brush. I'm gonna make it a lot smaller. It's taking too long, so let's go to the slider and bring it down even further. Okay, so I have my brush, right? And I can pick a color. Let's go with the blue. And I can kind of go in here and, you're gonna take your time. And then I can go in here and start to play around with this. Something like that. Again, soft light wins the day. It just does a wonderful job. And then I can, with other brushes, I can add other colors. I can, mix and match my colors. So if I wanted to add, like, say, some yellowish detail in the middle, I'm going to make my brush really, really tiny. And then I can kind of just fleck, and you can do all kinds of things. Now, obviously, I'm really playing around here, but you can do all these kinds of things. And I would do this on separate layers. Right now I'm doing it on the same layer. The other way that you can do it is by using, well, actually I'll do it on the other eye, using a hue and saturation layer. So I'm going to change the hue. And if it doesn't work with hue, that's kind of, you can also colorize. So I really don't like either. See, sometimes the brush method works better. So I'm just gonna take that pretty far, take the saturation pretty high, and bring down the lightness a little bit. And then I'm gonna invert my mask, obviously, because I'm just gonna affect the eye. And I'm gonna take my brush, make that a little bigger. Oops, too big. And then I'm just gonna affect that area. So you can do that as well. And then now if I back out, now she's got two different color eyes, but you can do that. You can emphasize somebody's eyes by adding more of the same color, or you can completely change it to a very different color. So that is kind of what I had to show you guys tonight. I don't know if there's any questions in the Q&A or in chat that somebody wants to tell me if there are. And I can take a look at those and answer those fairly quickly. Otherwise, this video will be available later on. We will post it to our YouTube channel. So if there are things that you would like to review, you can definitely do that. The other thing that is available to you as well is if you are a Fountaindale Library card holder, you can go to our website. So I am going to go to our homepage real quick. And if you go to Learning and Tech, which funnily enough, I was at Learning and Tech, and then I go to my e-resources, you have the ability to go to, instead of the category where it's all or articles and research, you can go to lifelong learning. And then we have Linda available for you. So Linda has a lot of classes, a very, very long in-depth classes that you can take. So if I just type in photo, it'll bring up Photoshop. And you have a ton of training that is available. See, color lookup tables right here and profiles and things like that. And then you have like a lot of classes that you can take. So let me take a quick look at chat. So I think that is it. Do we have anything in Q&A? I can't see Q&A right now. Oh, there's Q&A.
No questions at this point. Just a thank you for the tutorial, and I think that was very, very well done.
All right. Well, I hope that everyone learn something from this. I hope that you're able to pick something up for you and, be able to kind of take some of these techniques and play with them yourself. Skin is something that we're always trying to perfect when we're doing portraits, and, Photoshop definitely has a ton of tools that you are able to use to perfect the skin. We're going to have more Photoshop classes, and we're going to continue with our virtual programs for the time being as we all try to remain safe. But we will be bringing in more Photoshop classes, more photography classes, and then later on at some point, I will see you all in person, hopefully at some point. You can always stop in and ask questions. You can also send them via email to studio300@fountaindale.org, and they will get filtered to me for anything Photoshop or photography related. And then I can, answer those questions as you have them. So I thank you all for coming and joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed the class, and I look forward to the next time that I get to see you guys.